Hello, and welcome to Inclusive Marketing for Indies, How to Be Intersectional. I'll introduce myself before I get started. My name is Melissa Chaplin, and I'm a consultant at Robot Teddy. Before I started in this role, I have a background in indie games marketing. Over the past year and a half, I was head of client strategy for a PR and marketing agency focused on indie games. So I worked on a lot of projects in rapid succession on the strategy side of things. Going further back in my origin story, before that I did a PhD in intercultural communication and intersectional feminism. So that's part of why this topic is so close to my heart. And hopefully by the end of this talk, it'll be close to yours as well. So what I'm going to speak about today is, first of all, I'm going to define intersectionality. What on earth does that mean, and how are we going to be using it in this presentation? Once we've established that, I'll explain what on earth that has to do with indie games, and in particular, indie games marketing. When we've got through that initial hurdle, I will apply intersectionality as a framework to different elements of your marketing campaign. So content, communications, and community. For each of those, I've got examples of games and projects that I've worked with and how they've approached an intersectional sort of marketing, and how you might be able to apply that to your game as well. And finally, we'll sum everything up before I let you go. So what is intersectionality? This is quite an academic term, but it became quite popular in mainstream culture over the last decade or so. It was originally coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw, who's quoted here from Time magazine last year, describing it as a lens or prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. Originally, Kimberlé Crenshaw came up with this as a way of explaining how Black women experience oppression, both in terms of their race and in terms of their gender. Over time, since she coined it decades ago, it has grown to include other aspects of identity, so things like sexuality and disability and so on and so forth. So that's what intersectionality means, is an awareness of those different aspects of people's identity and how they can relate to them experiencing systemic oppression. What on earth's that got to do with indie games marketing, you ask? Well, I'm glad you did. I have been pleasantly surprised by how useful I have found my PhD in my job. In particular, I have found this grounding in an intersectional approach, and that toolkit really useful for approaching difficult decisions and conversations and concepts in marketing. So the way that I see it, the principles of intersectional marketing are, first of all, humility. You can't possibly get everything right, and at some point you are going to offend and upset someone and get it wrong, no matter how hard you try. If you start from the point of, I don't know everything and I'm going to mess up sometimes, you will respond much more appropriately when someone does call you out on, a mistake that you've made. The next one is empathy. You've got to be compassionate and have empathy for other people whose experiences might be different from your own. This is always something you're going to need in any intersectional approach. Finally, inclusivity. You should be trying to be as inclusive as possible if you want to be intersectional. That doesn't mean that your games have to appeal to everyone. It's totally fine if someone doesn't enjoy your game, say, because they don't like the genre. If they're like, oh, well, point and click adventures aren't for me. It isn't okay if they don't enjoy your game because your game is homophobic and, or your marketing messaging is homophobic and that's, upsetting to them. So that's what I mean by inclusivity. So I'll start with that first pillar of content. This will give some worked examples. The first way in which content is relevant is representation. Now, the reason why this is important is because if your game in itself is, reinforcing prejudice or stereotypes and upholding, inequality, then it doesn't matter how inclusive you try to make the marketing campaign. Ultimately, it's going to fall flat because it doesn't mesh with the game itself. So we'll start by talking about representation in a game that is, one of my favorites. Star Seeker and the Secret of the Sorceress Standoff. And I challenge you to say that 3 times quickly. This is a, murder mystery game, very kind of small but perfectly formed is how I describe it. And in it, Star, the main character who you can see on the left here, has pronouns default to they, them. But one of the lovely options that the developer provided was to add in a choice in the options menu. You could choose any pronouns you wanted for Star. It didn't affect the story at all, doesn't affect their presentation at all. And it's just something that was a real kind of nod to inclusivity. And people really appreciated it and responded to this. Reviewers picked up on it when they were writing about the game and said how much they loved this feature. It definitely, made people feel welcome when they were playing this. And I thought it was just a lovely example. We did highlight it and advise the developer to highlight it on social media because we're like, actually, you know what, that's really cool that you did this. And I think that, he was pleasantly surprised that we thought it was even worth mentioning, but it absolutely is. Another game that I want to represent as good for representation is Guildlings. So we worked with Guildlings on their kind of second installment. It's an Apple Arcade game, and it's absolutely fantastic. If you haven't played it, I really, really recommend it. It is an RPG in which, battles are fought with emotions and feelings and mood. It's a lovely game. And one of the things that makes it so lovely is that it has such a diverse cast of characters. So, the characters are diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of not being stereotypical, in terms of gender presentation, and in terms of sexuality. One fan favorite character from the first installment was this very dashing mailman that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, who is the object of affections of a boy who is one of the playable characters, Chaz. And Chaz has a crush on the mailman throughout. This features in both installments of the game, and the community really loved it. One of the things that I thought was so fantastic about this was it wasn't made into a kind of tokenistic element. It wasn't like this kind of, Chaz is gay or coming out or anything like that. It was just like, and obviously Chaz has a crush on the mailman, which, is part of why it was so beloved by the community as a feature, because it wasn't there in a sort of obvious, we're making a point sort of thing. It was more just an element of this character. And it was a really great example of representation done right. I can't recommend this game enough. I really want to give a shout out here to Wholesome Games, who have specifically said that for them to consider a game wholesome, it can't be upholding any sort of systemic inequality, and that it should be inclusive. I really appreciate that they've said that. That doesn't mean that all intersectional games have to be wholesome, or have the kind of aesthetic that we associate with wholesome. What it does mean is that if you want to consider, your game in this sector, if you want to be considered for features and things like Wholesome Direct, which, I've worked with several games who have been featured by Wholesome Games and have found it really, really helpful. It's given them massive community boosts. Then you need to be thinking intersectionally in your design and in your comms, because otherwise, you will not be considered for this. Another totally separate element of content is the accessibility of a game, and increasingly this is something that journalists are aware of and writing about and picking up on. And there are a couple of games that I've worked with that I think really stand out here. First of all, Blind Drive, which came out earlier this year, is a game that can be played with no visuals whatsoever, which has made it really accessible for any players who have impaired vision. This is something that was picked up on by reviewers repeatedly as being, a really great element of the game. Ollie Smith for Pocket Gamer, I've quoted here, who talked about how fantastic it was that this was an option. The very minimal UI that you can see in the screenshot there can be completely turned off. So, you can play it just with headphones and no visuals whatsoever. And the other thing that was really wonderful to see was the joy of vision impaired streamers when this game came out, and some of the launch day live streams and things like that people did. It's, in terms of its content, it's not a cutesy game at all. Intersectional doesn't mean cutesy, but it is a game that has opened up possibilities and, was very conscious of accessibility from the absolute beginnings of the design. Another one I'd like to give a shout out to that isn't so off the wall in its accessibility options, isn't so unusual, is Eater, which is published by Armor Games and is a bullet hell. Eater was praised in reviews, as you can see from this quote here, for accessibility options. In Eater, you can turn your damage up so that you do exponentially more damage, which is great if you're finding it too challenging, but you still want an element of risk. You can also toggle invulnerability if you're like me and you just want to enjoy the story, but you couldn't get past any of the bosses without that. It's a really great option as well, because it's not something you have to have on and that's the whole game. You can toggle it, so when you struggle you can switch this on and off as needed. Again, not a particularly kind of cute game, although it may look it from the cat and the little character I've put here, but it's quite it's got some quite gruesome villains in it. But this element was something that was really appreciated by a lot of people. So, okay, fine. We've made a game with intersectional content. We've made something that's progressive and inclusive. What about communications? Like, how do we start to put this into action as we are actively in a marketing campaign? So the first thing I want to say is you should absolutely be reaching out to diverse creators. I've got the logos here for Black Girl Gamers and Rainbow Arcade, who are groups of streamers who are Black women in the first instance and LGBTQ in the second. There are diverse creators out there, and you should be prioritizing having a range of representation in the journalists and writers that you contact, and also in any influencers and streamers that you contact. First of all, because it's the right thing to do, but second of all, because you should want to have diverse voices and representation who are playing your game and promoting your game, because that's how you access diverse audiences. Your audience will not be a monolith. Gamers are a diverse bunch of people. Increasingly, there are studies that show that. So as a priority, you should make sure that you are demonstrating that in your PR approaches. It's good business, it's common sense, it's also the ethical and moral thing to do. With that being said, there are also other things that you can think about in terms of taking an intersectional approach to communications. And one thing I want to highlight is the attitude that you take to other games, other developers and professionals and stuff like that. And the example I have here is from the Big Adventure event, which was the brainchild of Jordan, who works at HitSense, which is a small indie publisher. The Big Adventure event brought together developers from loads of different games, hundreds, all of which were adventure games, many of which were not published by HitSense and didn't have any connection to HitSense. HitSense organized this with an attitude of, a rising tide brings with it all boats, and included developers in this event that maybe wouldn't have had the opportunity, the access, small solo developers who have self-published and things like that. And what happened was that actually the strength of numbers of the event meant that it got some fantastic PR coverage. As you can see, there's an article in Polygon about it. And the developers who participated saw increased sales as a result. I think that one of the wonderful things about indie games is the attitude of camaraderie that we see. And I'm sure there are examples of this not happening, but I've been really heartened by how many people I've seen support one another, how developers share each other's work and, tweet each other's launch announcements, and how there is this sense of, shared experience and support and community. People are not going to buy just one indie game broadly. They will buy multiple indie games. You will be able to approach things in a much more intersectional way if you look at people as your peers rather than your competition, and embrace this community spirit. I'm getting mushy. I think that this is one of the most wonderful things that we can have as people working with indies. And it's also a way that we can push back on kind of the inequalities of, studio size and funding and, accessibility to, promotional events and things like that. And I think initiatives like this are fantastic and a really great way of working intersectionally. So next we're going to talk about community, and which is obviously significant for almost every indie game. And I'm going to start with a game that you might not think of immediately on this topic, which is Not for Broadcast. Not for Broadcast is far from a cutesy game. In it, you are managing the news and you have to select camera angles. And in one part of the game, there's a streaker on a football pitch, and you have to manage the camera angles so that the audience don't see, the streaker's genitals. It's not necessarily what you think of as kind of, in the same spirit as some of the other games I've mentioned. But one of the things that was really interesting about this game is that it was very political, very obviously and explicitly political. And that actually sparked a lot of very difficult communications for the developers to have with their community, especially because people were trying to interpret the game and how it reflects on the developer's personal politics. And actually misinterpreting the developer's personal politics as a result. It's set in a dystopian future, and the government in it are a left-wing government. Now, people started to therefore assume that that meant that the developers really supported, kind of far-right movements, which they didn't, and they wanted to clarify that. Throughout this process of having to kind of, explain and have these conversations, the developers were always super patient with, their community. They never got frustrated. They were never defensive. They were always very open. And I've got a screenshot here from a Steam update. What they wanted to do was really challenge people's sense of comfort in their own ethics. And they also wanted to set up a situation where, people who considered themselves to be progressive could look at it and say, well, these are people I might have voted for. And that's, that's a really, really difficult thing to deal with in a video game. But the way that the developers approached this was very much with a sense of transparency, with that humility that we talked about earlier, and always being kind of empathetic to the concerns of the community. So I thought that was just a really great example. Another example of really empathetic community management comes from another game that I love very much, Weaving Tides, which just came out recently. So little mention for them. Weaving Tides, I was working with on their Kickstarter campaign, and we were planning to launch, as you can see from the screenshot, in late March 2020, which was around about when the pandemic stopped being something abstract that we were seeing occasionally in the news and started being something really quite scary that was very close to home for us here in I'm in the UK and the developers are in Austria. And we had a really tough conversation and a really hard call to make to delay the Kickstarter. But developers felt very strongly, and we felt very strongly, advising them that it wouldn't be appropriate or sensitive to launch the Kickstarter when everyone was suffering from such instability and uncertainty about things like their livelihoods. So we made the decision to delay. And in the end, it was absolutely the right thing to do. The Kickstarter went really well a month later, but also the community really appreciated how thoughtful the developers were. And they continued to be really empathetic and thoughtful throughout the entire pandemic. They set it in their Discord so that people could opt out of seeing any updates that referenced COVID-19, particularly if they were, if someone's in the Discord because they want an escape from, kind of difficult news, so they wouldn't have to see anything that referenced that. And that's just, an example of how thoughtful they were throughout the whole process. And it's something that I really admired and appreciated about their approach. It was a starting point of trying to make everyone feel welcome and included. And it's also reflected in the game, which is lovely. I really want to give this as an example, and this is not a game I worked on at all, but it was such a fantastic, moment of intersectional marketing that I just needed to highlight this here. And I experienced this as a community member. So from the reverse side, Nocia is, again, a brilliant game. This is, it's a werewolf game, but single player, and it's on the Nintendo Switch. And it was translated from Japanese into English and released in English earlier this year. In that translation process, there were some issues. So Nocia is broadly, it's quite good for, gender representation. Setsu, this character on the right with the blonde hair, is non-binary. They're one of the main characters that you interact with. This character, Rakio, on the left, is also non-binary. But there was a really uncomfortable scene in the original release, which focused on, a discussion of Rakio's physiology that was not really appropriate, and it felt a little bit misgendering and unpleasant. And people picked up on this and were talking about it on Twitter, saying like, "Oh, I love this game, but what's that about?" And, the people who were tweeting about it hadn't tagged Playism at all, but the community manager spotted this and immediately said, "Thank you for pointing this out. I'm so sorry. We will fix it right away." And, the person who'd made the original comment started saying, "Oh my God, I feel bad that you saw this," not thinking, I tweeted it thinking that you wouldn't, be looking. And the community manager handled this absolutely appropriately from an intersectional standpoint and said, "Don't feel bad at all. We screwed up. Thank you for bringing this up. We don't want to cause hurt and suffering. We can't leave it at this." And within, a few days, I think it was that weekend, they had patched the game to alter that scene and make it much more inclusive, to remove the uncomfortable misgendering. And, it's a better game for it. this is such a great example of best practice for so many reasons. First of all, because it's made the game better, by listening to this feedback and responding to it swiftly. It changed it from being something that could have, become a real sticking point for a lot of community members and, made people think less of the game into something that was dealt with. And now people who buy the game, won't even experience that original, misused pronouns because it's not there. Second of all, you can absolutely see that all of those principles of inclusivity, empathy, and humility are at play here. There's no defensiveness or protesting or anything like that, nor do they ignore the situation. Instead, they absolutely admit fault straight away and correct, which is, it's all anyone wants, really. People don't, if people call you out on something, if people say this isn't right or this is uncomfortable, it's not because they're trying to hurt you or your game. It's 9 times out of 10 because they actually love you in the game and they want to help and help fix a problem. And this is a perfect example of this and how it can be done right. So, to sum up the main takeaways from this, because I think it's good to reinforce what the actionable points are. The first thing is that you can use intersectionality as a framework for approaching your communications. When you're doing your marketing, you can use this as just a way of thinking about how to make decisions, how to frame things, how to understand the viewpoints of your community. The next thing is resist unjust power structures in everything you do. Intersectionality is not something where you can talk the talk if you don't walk the walk. You have to really commit to this. Like I say, that doesn't mean making one type of game. It doesn't mean, that you have to have a certain aesthetic or anything like that. But what it does mean is that you need to think about, am I helping marginalized people with what I'm doing here, or am I hurting them? It's not easy, but it is important, and it's something that we all contribute to. If you're not part of the resistance, then you're part of the empire. Finally, mistakes happen. Own them, even with all the preparation. Even if you spend 4 years doing a PhD on this, you will definitely still have moments where you think, I messed that up. I said the wrong thing. I've hurt someone. If that happens, then the best thing to do is to just own it, let go of any feelings of pride or ego about it, and just approach it with that sense of humility. And that is what will lead you to the best possible outcome for yourself, for your players, and for the rest of your team. Thank you so much for listening to this. And, if anyone wants to ask me any questions or anything like that, you can find me on Twitter, and I'll leave it there. Enjoy the rest of GDC.